Hey guys, we're back. And I'm back today with my producer, Chelsea Morrow. Chelsea, welcome back. Everybody loved you so much the first time that we decided that at least some of my solo episodes would be semi-solo, which actually doesn't mean you're half a person, but we would do it more like a Q&A because maybe it's more fun for people to listen to me answer questions than it is to me just yap to myself for any period of time. Plus, you're really good at helping me keep on track. So thank you so much for being here again, Chelsea.
Of course. Yeah, it's so fun.
Yeah. Okay. So we are going to talk today about, we've been tossing around a whole bunch of different ideas and, we've invited you guys, the listeners, before, and we're going to continue to say, let us know. What do you want me to cover in these solo episodes? And today I just thought, because everybody's always so keen on bioregulators and peptides, that we would just cherry pick one bioregulator and kind of dive into it a little bit for the next 15, 20 minutes to give you guys a taste of the kinds of stuff that we can start to dig up about the bioregulators. One of the things about bioregulators, I think that people forget is there's actually a lot of research that's been done on them. It's just a little harder to get your hands on it. A lot of it's still in Russian. And sometimes, for example, today we're talking about pinealon. It won't show up in the research as pinealon. They'll post it as EDR. So EDR, short chain peptide, does this. And it's like, who would know that it's EDR? So anyway, so I'm going to let Chelsea fire some questions at me. And then that way it'll give some body and context to the information that you're going to get.
Amazing. So there are some misconceptions and myths around pinealon. So I thought that before we dive into, what it is, what we use it for, just to kind of clear the air and kind of bust the main myths around this bioregulator.
For sure. And I think, what it is it's not as much a myth as it is a misunderstanding. Mm-hmm. So pinealon has the word pineal in it. And that means that a lot of people think that the pinealon is the pineal bioregulator, when actually it's not. The pineal bioregulator, when we talk about the pineal bioregulator, we're talking about epitalon. And epitalon, or I call it epitalon, some people call it epitalon, like it's, but aside from every peptide having many different names, people pronounce them completely differently. So it just adds to the, the symphony of confusion that surrounds these little tiny proteins. Mm-hmm. But basically, epitalon is a 4 amino acid bioregulator, whereas pinealon is a 3 amino acid bioregulator. And pinealon is it's considered to be the brain bioregulator. So it's more of a central nervous system application, whereas epitalon is really much more focused, when we talk about it, on the pineal gland, mm-hmm. which isn't to say that it doesn't have applications in certain other places in the body, but we're not talking about epitalon today. Maybe we'll do one of these for that. Mm-hmm. But definitely when it comes to pinealon, it is really thought of as the brain bioregulator or the central nervous system bioregulator.
Amazing. Okay. So maybe now we can dive into how it works on the brain and talk more about how it's the brain bioregulator.
So the other thing about pinealon the other name thing about pinealon that gets misconstrued is it also has another name, which is cortexin. And cortexin is the trademark name for the actual biological extract. Pinealon is actually the name of the synthetic bioregulator. So we know that when they extract these bioregulators from the tissues, glands, and organs from the animals, they can be prepared in preparations and it depends on the peptide, but definitely many of them are available as capsules. So they're oral bioregulators, but then sometimes they will isolate that exact amino acid chain, and that exact amino acid chain is synthesized in a lab, and that can be used either by subcutaneous injection, or it can be used quite often in sublingual sprays or drops, and some of them are even bioavailable intranasally.
Wow, that's amazing. I think that is one of the biggest misconceptions that we see, especially with people inside of your BSP community. So I'm glad that we were able to clear the air with that. So now that we know that it's the brain bioregulator, maybe you can tell us some of the basic details we need to know about this and exactly what it's doing in our brain when we use it.
Yeah. Okay. Also, it has a third name, which is sirtuin. But so you guys, if you see sirtuin, cortexin, or pinealon, they're all part of the same family, just so you know. Okay. So some of the ways, there's still a lot that is not known, but from a broad perspective, it is considered to be neuroprotective. This pinealon. It seems to be able to protect brain cells from the effects of hypoxia, which is lack of oxygen. So, for example, in stroke, it might have an application there. It also positively affects circadian rhythm. It has beneficial effects for memory and it enhances learning. And it seems to have effects also on mood. And I'm missing one more here. Also, it specifically has been shown to have some benefits for people with cognitive decline and even Alzheimer's. There's a couple of specific studies on Alzheimer's. It gets pretty technical in there, so we're not going to go too deep in those weeds, but know that it definitely seems to have applications in all of these areas. It also seems to, that whole neuroprotective thing, it seems to protect neuronal cells like brain cells from apoptosis. So that's cell death. So it's, there's a lot that still seems to be, that's still under study. But definitely it has pretty wide ranging effects. And one of the things that it also does that I actually, didn't realize originally, because I've always thought as a pinealon as the one bioregulator that affects telomeres positively. So now telomeres are the ends of your DNA. The people refer to them as those tape kind of ends of the shoelaces on the DNA. Every time your DNA replicates, you lose a little piece of telomere. And when the telomeres get too short, your DNA can no longer replicate. Right? Mm-hmm. So anything that's going to protect those telomeres so that your DNA can keep replicating is seen as a benefit in the longevity space. And whereas pinealon upregulates the production of an enzyme called telomerase, right, which restores those telomeres, pinealon does it through a different pathway using a different compound called irisin. And what's really interesting about irisin is actually found mostly, it's mostly thought of as being found in skeletal muscle, but there's actually high levels of irisin in the brain as well. And you make more irisin in your brain by exercising. So that might be yet another way that being physically active and exercising can help with your longevity, because if you have more irisin, it seems, has a positive benefit for telomeres as well. And it does that through pinealon.
Wow. That
was a really long answer. I'm sorry.
No, it's amazing. This one bioregulator seems to do so many different things, from affecting your circadian rhythm to telomeres. That's kind of wild.
Yeah, it is. And the other way that it protects brain cells, actually, I forgot to mention, is it protects brain cells from oxidative stress. Right? Yeah. So oxidative stress is a natural process, like your mitochondria working, and as they work and, getting busy, they're creating reactive oxygen species. And we need some of those, but we want to make sure that gets mitigated. And so one of the ways the pinealon seems to be protective to the brain is by mitigating that oxidative stress. And I would say that, one of the things that's also really interesting about bioregulators, in particular this one, is when you look at some of the human studies that were done, generally speaking, you see the benefits mostly in people who are older or people who've had brain injuries or people who have issues. So it doesn't mean that it's useless to anybody, to younger, healthier people. But I do think that, when they talk about it has benefits for memory and learning, you're going to see it more in the people who have been impacted by something that's impacted their memory and learning.
Interesting. Yeah. And I do want to have us dive into the research, but before we do, I am curious, before at the beginning you mentioned that there's a different form of this brain bioregulator and pinealon is the synthetic form. Why is it that we want to go with the synthetic form?
We don't necessarily. I mean, it's when to use the synthetic and when to use the biologic is, I think this is where the art of bioregulators comes into play. And probably there's also a lot of science, obviously, and we don't see all of it. Definitely, for some people, it's easier for them to get their heads around taking capsules with the oral bioregulator, and that's going to be the extract. And it's considered a nutritional supplement. Like it's not quite as chemically feeling. You know what I mean? Like it's almost like a food, not quite, but it's almost like a food versus the synthetic is, it's interesting because it gets used a little bit differently in Russia. When they're going for a therapeutic application, they seem to flip between the two, but sometimes from what I've learned, what they seem to do is they will very often start with the synthetic because it gives you a faster effect. It's almost like it's more targeted and it's more concentrated. And so they kind of kick things off with the synthetic and then they might continue with the oral kind of biologic. But it really depends on the bioregulator because when we look at other bioregulators, like for example, Pinealon or the thymus bioregulator, those have natural kind of biological extracts that can be used as injections intramuscularly. And that brings in like a whole other name, like that's epithalamin for Pinealon and thymolin for the thymus one. And those are considered to be the most powerful versions, but they're also very hard to get a hold of. As a matter of fact, Cortexin, I believe, is that form as well. And it's an intramuscular injection. It's very hard to get outside of Russia.
So with that being said, maybe we could take a few minutes to dive into some of the research that's going on around this bioregulator and the research showing these benefits.
Yeah. So look, there's, the research is very broad. I mean, definitely you've got everything from human trials with Alzheimer's patients to, and I mean, a lot of the human stuff is really happening and has happened in Russia, right? And so they've done some studies, and very often what's really interesting about a lot of the bioregulator study that you'll get from Russia is very often what they're doing is they're pairing the bioregulator with conventional treatment. And I think that's a really important thing to remember for everybody that, even though it seems to show benefits for people with some cognitive decline or Alzheimer's, that kind of thing, never forget that there's all the other pieces that may also help. So for example, I recently, in my membership community, a woman came in and, her mom is suffering from dementia and cognitive decline. She's got terrible memory issues. And I want to say maybe it has been diagnosed as Alzheimer's, but sometimes it's a little bit harder to get to those diagnoses. And her mom's, she's getting on in years. She's like 91 years old. But we were talking about it on one of the Q&As, and one of the things I mentioned for the brain was ketone esters as a supplement. And I didn't even know, that this was going on for this woman in this group. And she came back about a week later and she said, okay, I was in the Q&A last week, and I'm just going to say that one thing I picked up was worth the price of admission in the group because she went off, she got her hands on some ketone esters and gave them to her mom, and it literally, it totally did exactly what it can do in a best case scenario where it just brightened up her mother. It gave her mother's brain access to a source of energy that it didn't have access to. Right. So sometimes in Alzheimer's or certain neurodegenerative diseases, the brain becomes insulin resistant. So it can't use glucose, which is what it would normally use as fuel. And because it's very hard with these people to get them on a ketogenic diet, they don't have access to ketones. So sometimes when you give these guys a ketone ester, it's essentially you're just all of a sudden you're providing a fuel source for brain cells that they can use. And you see this impact. So she talked about how her mom knows that she has to drink the icky drink because they taste horrible. But it makes her feel better, and it gives her, it helps her brain to function better. So it's just really interesting that these bioregulators very often will get used with a conventional therapy. And so, not that ketone esters are a conventional therapy by any stretch of the imagination, but even they'll use them with medications, right? So for someone who's had a stroke, for example, they'll still have whatever other medications that they're giving to the person. Because, one of the things about stroke, because it's a lack of blood supply, therefore oxygen. So that's that hypoxic thing I was just talking about earlier. You want to get to that person as soon as possible, right? So some of the people in this space, like some of the experts in this space, I know in their freezer have like a little kit, and it's got all these peptides in it, and there's instructions, and it says, in the event of me having a stroke or whatever it is, administer this as soon as possible.
Wow.
Right. And so Pinealon might be in that stack because it's going to, what you want to do is you want to prevent as much as possible permanent damage by helping the brain to be more resilient to whatever the insult was. So you asked about research. There's a couple of other ones that are kind of interesting. There's one that was done. What was this discussion we were having about in vivo and in vitro? So this is really interesting. And this is a distinction that is important to make, right? When we talk about research, we have to be careful that sometimes they're doing research in a test tube. And so it looks like something might be good for whatever process when they're looking at it in a test tube, but actually they haven't looked at it yet, even in an animal model. And usually in research, just for those of you who may not be as familiar, I'm sure that a lot of you are, because, the audience here tends to be fairly sophisticated, but for the people who aren't necessarily up on this stuff, know that very often the research starts in a test tube. So they'll take, for example, brain cells, and they'll expose them to lack of oxygen, and then they'll throw in like a bioregulator or whatever, and they'll take a look at a cellular level, what seems to be happening. And which is really helpful, right? Because then what they do is they go, okay, well, if you can do this in the test tube, let's look and see if it will if it'll give the same effect in an animal, right? And so then some poor little mouse or rat, sadly sustained some horrible brain injury or whatever, and they apply the peptide. The lucky guys get the peptide. And in a best case scenario, those results are translated in the animal, and then we take it over to human research eventually, right? And that's part of the reason why it takes so long for a lot of this research to get out to people and to get used, because by the time they've done it in the test tube, then they're doing it in the animals, and they start with, rats and mice. Sometimes they start with flies, like who knows, right? Then they'll move to rats and mice, and then they'll move up to larger animals, then primates, and eventually to humans. So sorry, I went a little deep on that one, but one of the other things that, one of the places where in vivo they saw an effect was it seemed to affect a compound that supports serotonin production, right? Now, in some of the human studies that they did in Russia, they talk about it helping with mood. And of course, if we have more serotonin in our system, it would impact our mood positively. Having said that, that specific impact on the serotonin was observed in vitro, not in vivo. So it was in cell cultures. I mean, they were brain cell cultures, but nevertheless, they were cell cultures in a test tube. So it remains to be seen, if that translates into humans. I would say that from what I've observed in my communities, so this is not scientific fact, but from what I've observed in the communities, it's not sending anybody's serotonin levels up or down or sideways, because don't never forget that the hallmark of the bioregulator is really that it tends to try to reestablish balance rather than pumping things up or boosting them. So I don't think it would have like a major issue for serotonin. Having said that, if someone's on SSRIs, you're going to want to be cautious on the off chance that it could have that kind of impact. Another really cool study that they did with Pinealon, which people wouldn't necessarily expect, is they did a study on athletes, on competitive athletes, and they used Pinealon with one of the immune bioregulators. Now, we know that competitive athletes, their immune system sometimes takes a massive hit just because they're working, like you're overtraining. And so if you're overtraining, it's excess stress to the body and you just tend to get sick more often than the average bear. And so one of the big things about athletes is keeping them healthy when they're in a heavy training cycle. So when they stacked it with Cristogen, which is another immune bioregulator, they did just 2 weeks of this. And they noticed that not only did they not get sick as often, but they actually adapted better to their sport. And they had better physical performance. And they are saying that it actually acts on two genes called the PPARA and the PPARG gamma gene. And these are all involved in cellular metabolism in muscles. So it's, it is pretty remarkable how. And if you think about it, as an athlete, you know that your central nervous system is critical to your performance. Like that communication from your brain to your muscles is a massive piece of how successful you're going to be and how successfully you'll be able to recruit the right muscle fibers at the right times. Now, I'm conjecturing right now. There's nothing in the literature that says exactly that, but it's not a real stretch to say that having a central nervous system that's more efficient and more dialed in is going to translate into better sports performance. And then the last one, which is really interesting because people really like to talk about biological age. And that is that there were some studies done in Russia, which is where the lion's share of this work is coming from, where they paired Pinealon with Vesugen. So those of you who are familiar with bioregulators know that Vesugen is the blood vessel bioregulator, and blood flow is going to be critical to the brain. And it's going to be critical to your whole body. That's why, when people ask me about my most popular stacks, it would be Epitalon, blood vessel, and thymus. Some days I think that maybe I should replace Epitalon with Pinealon, or I'm going to have to add a fourth leg to the stool with Pinealon. But they've done some studies where they showed that Pinealon and Vesugen seem to have a positive impact on biological age reversal. And what they don't talk about is how they were measuring that biological age. And I want to say right here, right now, that biological age is becoming this kind of term that gets thrown around by different companies measuring different things. Some of them are doing it through blood. Some of them are doing it through epigenetics. Some of them, there's just a million different ways. I'd say it's a bit of an amorphous construct right now, but regardless, it would appear that Pinealon with the blood vessel bioregulator together have a just work really well synergistically.
So kind of on that topic, I know that Pinealon really helps with anti-aging and longevity. So if someone wants to use it for these benefits, how would they incorporate it into their longevity protocol?
Great question. So if, let's say, you don't have anything particularly going on and you're just, let's say you're over the age of, I tend to say 40. I've actually seen in some of these papers, they talk about 35-year-olds as being benefiting. So who knows? And, these days people are under so much stress in so many different ways that there could be an argument for starting sooner. But let's say you wanted to just say, I just want to give my body a little bit of love.
Yeah.
In the 35 to 45 range, if you were going to start that early, you might do 1 month a year.
Okay.
Right? If you were using Pinealon, the synthetic, if you were doing using it as a subcutaneous injection, you might do 20 days of Pinealon as a subcutaneous injection. If you were using the oral bioregulator, you would probably do a 30-day course of 2 capsules a day. As you get older, right? So let's say we're over the age of 45 or over the age of 50, kind of pick your target there. You might do that twice a year. Right? And so now once we get into our 70s, maybe we'd go, 3 or 4 times a year. So if you really don't have anything major going on, you might just do these kind of little pulses intermittently. If let's say somebody's feeling like, like they're older and they're like, yeah, I feel like my memory's slipping, blah, blah, blah. Look, the first thing I'm going to tell you is, how's your diet? Are you exercising? Are you sleeping? How's your omega-3 status? Like all the basic things. But what that person we might do is we might say, okay, well, maybe we'll do that 30-day kind of reboot, but maybe what we'll do is we'll do 10 days a month for another couple of months just to kind of carry it out a little further. Mm-hmm. But again, like it's very dependent on the individual. It's not, there's nothing really etched in stone. And especially when you're using the oral bioregulator, when you're kind of taking it almost like a nutritional supplement, you want to pulse it in, but you don't necessarily need to be taking it all the time.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. So we've kind of looked at using this bioregulator for longevity, for if someone has declining cognitive health, for athletes. Are there any other people that could benefit from Pinealon? Oh my God.
Pinealon.
Are there any other people that could benefit from Pinealon? And if so, how would they incorporate it into their protocols?
Yeah, I think that's for the most part, that's about it, right? Anybody is going to want to support their brain health. Mm-hmm. Or anybody who's in this, whose area of interest is in this sphere. Does everybody on the planet need to tap into this to have a healthier, better brain? Mm-hmm. No, right? I think that this is a really interesting tool. It's the way we talk about bioregulators as, if we look at all the hallmarks of aging, the bioregulators aren't there. But if you look at the hallmarks of aging, definitely some of those hallmarks of aging would speak to what the bioregulators are able to do for us. Mm-hmm. So as part of a healthy aging protocol, they would be a really interesting thing to weave into your protocol over time. Mm-hmm. But I think that specifically, I'm trying to think we talked about stroke, we talked about some cognitive decline things, definitely on the Alzheimer's front, definitely maybe, the athlete. Yeah, I think that's about it. I think we covered most of it. Mm-hmm.
And then I guess just one last question on kind of the benefits or the uses. At the beginning, you had mentioned that it has an effect on circadian rhythm.
I'm so glad you went back to that. I was about to say, oh, wait, no, there's one more thing. Yeah.
So yeah, I'd love to hear kind of how it affects that and why we would want to use it for that.
So again, it's funny because I've always thought of Epitalon as the circadian rhythm regulator, and it seems that Pinealon also helps to regulate circadian rhythm. And so, so people they talked in the studies I was looking at, they were talking about shift worker, like the classic people who suffer from circadian dysregulation, and how Pinealon seems to help to restore, to reestablish proper to reset circadian rhythm. So again, people who are having sleep issues, I would never say that either of Epitalon or Pinealon will solve anyone's sleep issues, but it can be a piece of the puzzle. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And there are definitely people that I've seen in our communities where they'll use, I hear it more about Epitalon, but they'll use Epitalon and they'll be like, man, when I'm using that stuff, I sleep like a baby. And it could be that for them, whatever their sleep issue is, Epitalon just kind of flips that switch for them. Mm-hmm. Whereas a lot of other people have sleep issues. That's not their problem. Mm-hmm. Right? Or their problem is overriding this, they definitely have circadian dysregulation, but whatever other issue they have is overriding the circadian dysregulation. So just regulating the circadian cycle is not enough for them. Mm-hmm. But definitely there's good evidence on this one as well. So there could be an argument for someone who's really struggling with sleep. Mm-hmm. There could be a really good argument to say, let's maybe even pair Pinealon with Epitalon. And I would say, let's throw the blood vessel bioregulator in there for good measure. Mm-hmm. And let's see if that can be helpful, because maybe it's going to go at that circadian reset through a couple of different pathways, just like we saw with the telomeres. Mm-hmm. They go at it from different pathways through different chemical processes.
Mm-hmm. So when it's helping us with our circadian rhythm, it's really looking at our circadian rhythm through the sleep, not like our, how is it Sachin Panda kind of talks about the circadian rhythm is like our gut circadian rhythm and all of these different aspects. This is
right. So he talks about different circadian rhythms by organ system. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's definitely more the global. Mm-hmm. Right. So it's that master circadian cycle there. I think one of the things Sachin Panda talks about, he talks about different systems and organ systems and even cells having their own circadian rhythms, their circadian cycles. And so I'm not sure that these bioregulators will affect. I actually don't know the answer to that question. I'm not sure. I haven't read about it. Nobody really talks about it in the literature that I've seen. They're really more speaking about that global circadian reset that regulates our sleep-wake cycle.
Okay. Very interesting. So also you've chatted about a few different ways for us to administer the Pinealon. So how do we decide which is best for us, whether we want to go like injectables or orally?
So, I mean, a big part of it, of course, is always your comfort level. And I think that, I think from an ease and even from a compliance perspective, I think oral is always going to be easier. And you can get the synthetic as an oral as a sublingual spray. Okay. Right. So you can do oral for either the synthetic or the biologic, which is a nice feature. Right. For the subcutaneous injection, I mean, it's a little bit more aggressive. Right. So I think for me, if it was someone who was really having major issues and hopefully they'd be working with their physician and their practitioner team and talking about this and looking at it and then thinking about it as a subcutaneous injection, because that's going to be maybe the most efficient way to get it into the system. And they would be able to titrate the dosing based on the individual situation. But for people who are using it more as a preventative or, as one of these things that we're doing to maintain optimal health, I think that either the oral capsules or the sublingual drops or sprays would be great. And they'd be just as good.
That's good to know. So if someone just wants like longevity benefits, a supplement or oral form is perfectly fine. So let's say we're someone that we feel like this is something that we want to include into our protocol, or there's someone in our family that we think can benefit from it. Where would we find it even?
Right. So it's a good question. I mean, definitely availability of bioregulators over the last couple of years has been a little bit off and on, but definitely now. There's my favorite places people know is in the UK. It's called Profound Health. So it's profound-health.com. And, we'll put we'll put the discount code in the show notes. But there's also, if they happen to be out of stock, there's another company called Cosmic Nootropics that I really like. They carry it as well. And we'll put all this in the show notes. And then for the synthetic, the injectable ones, we'll put those down in the show notes as well. There's a couple of good, but at that point, you're kind of moving into research lab territory, which, people may or may not be comfortable with. I would just say, if you're going to go that route, then be very aware and do your homework and make sure that you're confident that who you're getting it from knows what they're doing, that they're not just buying some stuff from overseas and repackaging it here and selling it off, because it's unregulated. It's a bit of a wild west. And we just, these are really great. They seem to have a very good safety profile, but if you don't know what's in that vial, you don't know what you're putting into your body. Yeah. So we want to have clarity about what we're using.
Yeah, 100%. So for someone who, is super serious about this, who wants to get more serious about their longevity protocol or healing whatever health issue that they have. And, I feel like all the information out there that we can find, on people's podcasts or on their Instagram, it's always kind of surface level. So if we want to dive deeper into these topics, like where do we go for that?
Yeah, it's a good question. And, there's because it's still a very it's a new field in North America. It's not new in other places, but it's new here. I think it's still very much evolving. I mean, definitely, there are places, and the thing is that there aren't, even if you look at A4M and some of those organizations, they're not typically doing a lot of education around the bioregulators. Mm-hmm. In my membership community on BSP, the BSP community, mm-hmm. we definitely are doing regular deep dives into different peptides and bioregulators and trying to improve everybody, including my education level on these things. So we're always kind of digging around and looking for studies. And like I said, like we do deep dives mm-hmm. on the regular, like every month we have a new deep dive, and mm-hmm. I'm pretty sure I saw Pinealon on the lineup for the next couple of months. So yeah.
Oh yeah. If you like this episode, go join the BSP community and you can expect some more.
Yeah. Yeah. No, there'll be more.
Amazing. Well, I think that's, all the questions that I had for this bioregulator. Is there any last thing that you want to say about it?
No, I think we pretty much got most of it. I mean, I was, it's always interesting that, I myself, like I'm always learning about these things. And every time I go in and go digging around, like today, I found a paper that was published in 2022. Like there's actually some relatively recent research that's coming out, and that one was actually done by a team of Russian researchers, including Professor Kavinson, who's the guy, as we know, who really kind of discovered these and developed them and researched them, who sadly in December passed away. So yeah. So there's still new stuff coming up. And the good news is that he wasn't alone doing this research. It's gotten a lot of attention from a lot of people. So mm-hmm. it's about any other area in health optimization and biohacking. And that is that what you know today, you better keep looking, because tomorrow it's going to change, and it's going to change the day after that too. It's going to keep growing.
Yeah. Well, I think this was a great little deep dive into Pinealon. And if people want to learn more, head over to the BSP community.
Yep. Thank you. Thanks, Chelsea. This is fun.